I think that a lot of the people that I've talked to, and we have a session at the conference this fall that's going to address entrepreneurship and what that means as far as the problem you're going in to solve and the spirit in which you go in to solve it. And I think that startups kind of have a very good reputation right now because they value, again, values. So the things that they're going in trying to move the company forward with, as well as making sure that the people that they have are aligned with those values and making sure that there's always a connection with that, which, like we're talking about with any kind of enterprise that gets too large, it's harder to make that connection. So
Right.
part of that nimbleness is being able to be small enough to move everyone in the same direction, also recognizing that everyone's moving in the same direction. And I
Right.
think it's when you're either too big or too many people moving in different directions is where you get into problematic areas.
Right, and even big institutions, there are some big institutions that do things really well, but what sets them apart is that there's a very clear directive from all the senior managers, right? It's not. I believe in bottoms up too, right? Bottom up. So for people to have a more grassroots movement, for coalitions to be built. At the same time, the leadership has to be very clear about what it is that they value and what it is that they want to have done. When I was at BU, for example, the president, I mean, let's be honest, it's not just BU, it's a lot of other institutions. What I saw, and even though they never said it, what I saw was the ranking was important. The number of full-paying people, students, was important. It was more important to sort of game the system, and this is stuff that's happening across the country. And so as students, especially now, this is like we're in the peak of millennials graduating and starting their own companies. Millennials have a very different way of working, and we have institutions being run by baby boomers who are culturally so out of touch with millennials. And so, yeah, I think millennials sort of get it more and get that we don't necessarily need to have as much bureaucracy as we have, and to look at things a little bit. I don't know. Look at things from that startup perspective. I think startups only have gotten big because of our generation, and that's, I think, a point that people often miss.
I do. I think that it's one of those things where finding the best way to solve a problem, as a lot of startups are kind of started with the spirit of, is kind of the important part. So it's not necessarily ascending to, I want to be the director of an organization, or I want to be the president of an organization. Right. It's driven more about, this is a problem I'm passionate about solving. Whatever I need to do to get it done, whatever they want to call me as I'm doing it, is how that's going to get done. And I think that going in with that mindset into an environment that doesn't necessarily work that way, where things are based around what the title is or how much time you're spending in that office that's designated to you to solve that problem. Those are different constructs. And I think that trying to work together within those constructs is what causes a lot of dissonance or a lot of, not values necessarily getting misconstrued, but being in a situation that doesn't necessarily fit what you value. And like you said, a lot of that has to do with how you go about doing things. And if that organization that you're in is in alignment with that. Some of it's generational, but I also find that there are people that get it that aren't necessarily in that generation. So I agree with you in the sense that that's involved, but it's a harder thing to.
Yeah.
So as we look to kind of help students work through this process, what advice would you have for them as far as finding organizations that align with what they value, finding places that would be good for them to work based on how they work, and maybe finding ways to be attractive to startups if there is something that they value and someone has a small company and they want to get on board with that?
I think they need to ask an important question that students don't often ask themselves, and this is sort of like true for anyone actually looking for a job change or a place to go, is not necessarily even the why or the what, but how, right? Like how do you work? What are the parameters around which the organization is structured? Like those are things to ask yourself, I think, to make sure that you're not getting into a position where maybe the work is important and you like the work, but again, you're not a fit because of the way that things are structured or the way things are run or sort of the attitude of management. There's that, but also to always have the question or an awareness of what your particular constraints are. What is the cognitive box, right? So like when students are thinking about restructuring an organization or starting a new one, they have to be really critical about what are the assumptions that they're making that they're not aware of. So and this is really, really hard. Like this is the hardest part, to be aware of what assumptions you already have, right? So for example, that student government example that I gave, that students went in there with the assumption that they needed to have senators and representatives. They couldn't get out of that model until somebody else had to say, hey, no, that's not true. Like you don't have to structure it that way. And so one thing that students can do is always pay attention to the people who have different ideas. Always pay attention to the people who are, even if it sounds absolutely crazy, to entertain them and to sort of go with the idea as far as you can to see if it could work, and to not shoot people down just because they're saying something different, I think is really important.
I agree with that. I think that looking at a lot of students that I work with, be it on my campus or other places that I've been, things get attached to, like a lot of things we attach things to. So if someone comes up with an idea, it may be the words in which they're using to say it, or the time that they're choosing to say it, and not necessarily entertaining the opportunity for people to kind of be heard out, explain things in a way that other people around them will understand. You lose potentially good opportunities. And being able to go in with the mindset of solving a problem means sometimes doing it in a way that you hadn't been doing it previously. And being in an organization that understands that and values it, not everybody's doing it well, as we've talked about throughout this interview. Not everybody gets that some things will need to look a little bit different, are going to feel a little bit uncomfortable, are going to look vastly different from what some stakeholders might want or be familiar with. But being able to gauge all of those things as far as how successful you can be and to what degree you're going to allow those outside factors to affect what you do. So, I mean, yeah, so it's all tied up in there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I know that you had mentioned, as we always do, we ask about a book or maybe a different sort of resource that can give a little bit more insight on this. So Christian, what would you recommend?
Just came out this year. It's called Work Rules by Laszlo Bock, who's the VP of People Operations at Google. I don't know what his position now is with Alphabet and all that stuff happening, but he wrote it really about what makes Google Google, right? So like, why do people love working there so much? And it's a really good read. I don't think people need to agree with everything in the book, but it's about giving you a perspective that's so different from what most people are used to, that it further forces you to reflect on, let's say if you are a manager in an organization, to really reflect on whether there are better ways to structure your organization or to structure the way you do work, or the assumptions that you have going in with working with people. There were moments when I was reading the book and I kept hearing myself saying, this is me. If I knew this going into BU, I would have had so much of a better time adjusting and to learn how to take these values and apply it to the right situations. But I was at a loss for words. I didn't really know that there were other people who thought like I did. So, yeah.
And I think that's a great example. Google is a great example of a company that a lot of people kind of emulate. And I think some people really emulate it for the success and the ubiquity of it. But I think there's also something very different about emulating it for how they treat their people and how the organization is structured and how they empower individuals and how they're willing to look at things a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And sometimes
and it's not
success, you kind of have to look at things differently, as Laszlo Bock.
Right. I think the most striking part to me in the book was when they were talking about when people are leading a meeting, right, where they sit. So they're talking about symbols of power, and I very much see myself as an egalitarian, and I don't like symbols of power. I don't like titles to distinguish people too much. And they were talking about how one person just instinctively would never sit at the head of the table when he was leading the meeting. And I was reading that, and I realized that that's what I used to do. I used to sit in the middle on the side of a table and never at the head of a table. And there were a lot of people around me that were really caught up on who was sitting at the head of the table and who got to go to the meeting and who got to sit there. And to me, it was meaningless, and it felt so artificial to think about it, and a waste of time and energy to think about who was sitting at the head of the table. And again, that says a lot about values and about that if you go into a meeting or if you go into something assuming that some people are more important than others, then that's going to be your perspective, right? I always walk into a meeting assuming that everybody's equal, and so that changed the way that I led meetings and the way I talk to people. Again, it's about those assumptions that people have when they first enter a space. I think it's really critical to be aware of them.
I agree, and I think that kind of ties up a lot of what we're really talking about nicely, in that working within a certain level of expectations kind of yields a certain type of result. And when you're willing to work with different expectations or change the expectations of the environment that you're in, like startups have been able to do and like entrepreneurial thinking invites people to do, then you can get different results.
Right.
Sometimes that ends up being a lot better. It doesn't always, but I think that we're in a point in history where we're starting to see that more things can be solved that way. More and more every year as we start to see different issues that sometimes people didn't even realize that they had until someone tackled it a different way and it worked.
Yeah.
So
the other thought that I just had about startups is that also another thing about startups that's really more remarkable is that they're not afraid to fail. And they take the risk. They know that failure is on the horizon, right? It's success or failure, and there's nothing in between. And I think people need to adopt that more. People need to be okay with failure. Actually, this brings up another common thread with CrossFit, is that when I coach people, I always tell people, you don't have to always get that squat, or you don't always have to get something. But failing tells you a lot about what went wrong, tells you a lot about what you did well, and what you need to work on. And so when people fail, they think of it as like a personal reflection, and it's not.
Yeah, you failed at that thing. You didn't fail as a person. And I think that a lot of things are like that. CrossFit's like that. Most athletic endeavors are like that. Education is like that. You get things wrong in a lot of cases a lot more than you get them right. And that tells you both sides are educational. Getting things right lets you know that you know something. Getting something wrong can sometimes tell you a little bit more than that.
Yeah, I think my request for students would be, if that they are working in an organization, if they're working with people, or they're in a student group or something, and you think someone is failing, don't punish them. Right? Punishment is not something you want to do to someone who's failing. What you want to do is sort of bring them into the conversation and support them, and work with them to figure out what went wrong and how you, as a team member, can support that person so they don't make the same mistake.
I like that. I think that being able to accept that that's a reality for everyone that you will come in contact with, and then being able to be supportive and turn it into a success, turn it into a productive success, not just you didn't fail, so that's good, but you didn't fail and you got something out of it and the organization's better, so that's good.
Right.
All right. I mean, I can think of no better way to kind of leave us off than that. I think that's a fantastic point. So, Christian, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us. It's been a pleasure. I know I've come across work rules and didn't finish it, so I'm going to tackle it again.
Yeah, it's worth it.
I will do that, I promise, and I'll let you know how it goes.
Awesome.
All right, so thank you all for joining us, and keep an eye out for the conference in the fall. We're going to have a couple different sessions about entrepreneurship and startup culture and how that can inform your student leadership. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we will see you soon.